Hi, this is the second of the set of series on privacy and confidentiality, and I'm going to talk about the framework within which we're operating, which is the risk and utility framework. So I talked in the previous video about the importance of privacy. Well, really the only way, and confidentiality, really the only way to protect the confidentiality of a data set is to collect the data, dig a hole, and put it in the ground. And what we really want to do is we want to access it. So what I'm going to start off with now is to say, why is access important? Well, the reason it's so important is that data are dirty. They need to be cleaned, and they need to be, particularly these new kinds of data, which are administrative and digital in nature, they need to have a great deal of care in making sure that the data represent what we think they represent. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. You can't just be handed summary tables without understanding how the data are generated. Another challenge is, as anyone who's ever worked with a data set knows, they're not well defined. They are constantly changing. When you're dealing with programmatic data that are generated, as I said, by the administration of government programs, they could be changing every minute. Sensor data can be changing every second. So what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to deal with the inevitable changes and understand how the changes are evolving over time. In these new kinds of data that we're dealing with, quite often the data don't just sit in one spot and have all the elements that you need in order to answer a particular question. If you want to understand, for example, children going into delinquency in education, there could be many different factors that are contributing to it. The family situation, homelessness, it could be the work schedule of the parents. There can be many, many different things going on. There could be income challenges. And so you want to be able to link data from multiple sources. What you want to be careful about is that those linkages be correct. And regardless of how good any single individual is, you want to have other people be able to go in and check the quality of the linkages that are made. Another reason that access is important is that although data can be anonymized to the extent that kind of the average individual behavior can be described, much of the interest and the driving forces in economic and social activity is in outliers. So it's the people who are using the healthcare system the most. It is businesses that are generating the most economic growth or hiring the most people. And yet, because by their very nature, because they're behaving in a very different way from everyone else, that's what makes them important and interesting, but it also makes them more readily identifiable. And you want to be able to take a look at that. And for example, when I worked with the LEHD program, that program got developed over 20 years. There were literally hundreds of people that contributed. There was a whole village of statisticians and economists and computer scientists who built an infrastructure, and each person contributed to the anthill of knowledge. So it takes a village to build a high quality data infrastructure, and that means access. Here's another example, and this is a little bit of a strong example, and but you know, Leanna Wen and some work that David Elwood did for the Opportunity Project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You know, he's talked to Leanna, and she said, you know, every time a kid dies, all the commissioners get together and they share a fat file on the kid. But the only time they share the data is when the kid is dead. So, you know, lack of access to data means that quite often you can't intervene, and then there can be challenges. And data can make a difference. So this is a very, very powerful example, very well-known example where Allegheny County, which is the county in which Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is located, brought together data from human services. And what they did was they recognized that a case manager, when they get a call in from a police or a teacher or a neighbor saying, I think this kid's being abused, they have to make a decision on that call about whether or not to make an intervention, whether or not to send people to the house. Now, wrong decisions can have a negative impact in two ways, right? If the case manager incorrectly says there's nothing going on, the kid could get killed. If the case manager incorrectly says, I believe there is something going on when there isn't, then a child could be taken away from their family. So what Allegheny County did was they tried to figure out how to deal with privacy and confidentiality by creating a screening score. So they built an algorithm that predicted whether or not a child was likely to be abused, and then they provided that indicator to the screening staff. It was only meant to be as a summary piece of information that could be used to help the case manager add to the knowledge of the call that came in, as you can see, in combination with clinical judgment. But they applied that, and it made a difference. When they did an impact evaluation of the value of this tool, the data, it actually reduced the probability that they would make incorrect decisions in either direction. So data used wisely and well can in fact make a difference. And that's kind of the framework within which we operate. And this is in the textbook, which is showing that, the more privacy that you have, the less utility is generated. The more utility that is generated, in general, the less privacy. So the problem is how to decide what the trade-off is. And really, in terms of society, what you're thinking of is, here's the utility that we want to get to, or here's the amount of privacy we're willing to get up, and our decision is how to make that trade-off. And of course, the consequences of making different decisions can be quite substantial. So for example, the Census Bureau, which has, as you know, statutory authorization or requirement to protect the data, got so worried about privacy risks that what they have been doing is reducing the accuracy of the data. There's been a lot of conversation about that, because now what they're saying is that in increasing the amount of privacy protection, it's severely damaged the data infrastructure. So that trade-off is very, very clear. And the Census Bureau kind of backed off and said, well, we're rethinking what we're doing here. So what are we going to do? What's our framework? Well, the twin rules that we've used historically is informed consent and anonymization. And the problem is that neither of those rules hold in this new world. Helen Nissenbaum uses a famous saying is, it's either comprehensive or comprehensible, but not both, making that more concrete. If you were in the classroom, I would ask everyone in the classroom, how many of you use Google Maps? And almost everyone would raise their hands. And then I would say, how many of you actually read the notification that Google provided about how they were going to use their data? And almost no one would raise their hands. And part of the problem is that there are so many ways in which the data can be used that you can't possibly explain it. And because people don't really understand the ways in which the data can be used, and they vary their privacy in different ways, it's almost impossible to explain. Even when you try and explain it as carefully as possible, Frauke Kreuter has done a fair bit of work in this area, and you ask in a controlled environment, you've got a field interviewer, you've got a respondent sitting in front of you and you're trying to explain what the trade-offs are, then the response that you get can differ wildly depending on whether you ask, do you opt in or do you opt out? Do we put it in a positive way or a negative way? Do we put the question at the beginning or at the end? So in other words, it's not as though informed consent is a fixed idea that we can rely on. It appears to be a nebulous measure that is very difficult to use as a foundation for privacy policy. Anonymization is equally difficult. If you get the time, you should go off and take a look at this. You would think that internet searches, if you took away the IP address, would be completely anonymized. It doesn't have the famous HIPAA requirements of 17 identifiers, social security number, name, and so on, birth date, address. But it turns out that your browsing behavior uniquely identifies you. And so this was an example from the last decade in which very quickly it was possible to re-identify an individual. You can be re-identified not even from your searches, but you can be re-identified from the behavior of your friends. So again, this is a famous example in which Target predicted that a kid was pregnant before her father did. In fact, they were sending ads to her house saying, here's diapers, here's baby formula, and her father called Target up and said, why are you calling up? My kid's only 16. Well, it turned out that Target, based on the behavior of her friend's shopping habits, knew that she was pregnant before her father did. So turns out, however, there is some work that is being done, as I said before, both at the agency level, in terms of the federal data strategy, which is thinking about how to protect data, how to protect quality, and this new Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act that came out of the Commission report. So we are starting to get a framework within which to make decisions. Part of that framework could involve a trade-off between risk and access that is based on the value of the data for policy purposes. So in other words, if the data use can be shown to be a very, very high utility, you might be able to choose the highest risk category, and you could bucket the value of access to data in different characterizations. The approach that many places use for access to data is the 5 safes. In other words, you want safe people, safe settings, safe data. You have safe outputs that are a statistical disclosure limitation. And so each one of those 4 mitigate risk. In other words, what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to make sure that the people who access data are safe. We're going to make sure it's stored in a safe environment. We're going to make sure that we've de-identified to the extent that we can the social security numbers and names. And we're going to use statistical disclosure limitation techniques, about which I'm going to talk more in a minute, in the next video, in order to reduce the re-identification. And 3 of them refer to utility. The projects have to have value. The people have to be trusted and can produce data that output that has high value, and then that the risk is taken care of. The value of the output is ensured. So I think what's happening from a practical point of view is there is a lot of discussion about how to improve the way in which we provide access and use of data while at the same time minimizing risk. So in a really important new report that came out from the Data Foundation, they talk about a federally funded research data center that could build on best practices for confidentiality protection, improve linkages, provide access, develop measures, and produce, if you like, a PubMed for data, and then combine that with training. So I can recommend that you go off and read those. And then, of course, the massive investment in data science for undergraduates and graduates could be turned into a national extension service for data, so that it's not just a few people who understand how to use data wisely and well, but more broadly. So do use these chance to answer the questions on the website.